Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. With Crimea being safely returned to Russia, threats of sanctions and high costs to be paid continue at a steady pace. Russia has no intention of backing down, and the West is powerless to alter political facts on the ground. All the while, Ukraine faces political and economic collapse. To crosstalk the developments in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Sir Michael Arthur in London. He works with the Ambassador Partnership Consulting Group and is a former British ambassador to Germany and to India. In Paris, we cross to Jacques Cheminade. He is a former French presidential candidate and president of the Solidarity and Progress Party. And in Washington, we cross to Nebojša Malić. He is the director of the Rice Institute for Serbian Studies. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. If I go to Nebojša in Washington first, the lower house of the Russian parliament just passed the resolution to accept Crimea into the Russian Federation in a few hours' time. The upper house will. These are facts on the ground. We still hear talk of a second round or possibly third round of sanctions. Where are we going with this?
I'm not really sure where the West is going with this. I'm fairly certain after President Putin's statement yesterday that the Russian government is basically following legal procedure to finalize the accession of Crimea to the Russian Federation, which I believe should be formal by January 2015. I'm not really sure what the NATO governments are trying to do about this, or if they really want a new Cold War with Russia, or if they want a hot war with Russia. The signals I'm getting here are completely mixed.
Okay, Sir Michael, the same question. Where are we going with this here? Because we still hear talk of sanctions. We hear talk coming out of NATO that Russia is a threat, a new threat, and actually makes NATO feel needed again. How do you read this situation?
Well, I see it from Western Europe here as a major new crisis in the international order, which has been brought about because a UN Security Council permanent member has basically gone back on international agreements which it guaranteed and signed. I'm thinking of the Budapest Agreement and other things, and has annexed a bit of territory in a way which the international community has condemned and doesn't accept. I hear what you say about the Duma's latest actions today, but the fact is we are in a major crisis where the European Union and NATO, who are separate of course, will need to take and want to take further steps to express their disapproval of this move.
Okay, Jacques in Paris, I think we all agree this is a crisis. Who started it? Who's responsible?
Well, what I have to say that it's not really about Crimea or Ukraine. It's about a world monetary system, a financial world monetary system, which is in a state of absolute collapse. And then you had on the Russian side people like Sergei Glaziev or Dmitry Rogozin, who both called for the de-offshorization, which means a return to Russia of investments in the tax havens. And it's precisely those two persons, Rogozin and Glaziev, that have been sanctioned by the American authorities. So I think under what's happening in Ukraine, there is something which is much more important, which is the fate of the international world monetary system. And the Western powers, in particular the United States, but also the European Union, pushed by a certain British conception of domination of the center of Europe, pushed for what happened in Ukraine. And now we have in Ukraine a government composed with pro-austerity liberals in all the economics and financial ministries, and then also fascists in the sector of security. So you have this mixed bag, which is a very dangerous bomb ticking in the time. And on the other side, the reaction of Putin and Russia, which said, well, Ukraine is ours because under Catherine the Great and Prince Potemkin, it was ours. So you have this confrontation. I think the only solution is to bring forth a development system involving both Western Europe and Eastern Europe in a community of development, which we call that Helga Zepp-LaRouche, my German ally and friend, called a Eurasian land bridge. And this is this type of Eurasian common development.
Well, we're certainly not. We're not going in that direction right now. We're not going in that direction right now. Nebojša, if I can go to you, I'll ask you the same question. I mean, who is responsible, or maybe use a different word here? Who's the aggressor?
I would contend that the act of fomenting a coup in Kiev by basically the United States and the European Union is responsible for the crisis. Because President Yanukovych has been trying to appease the protesters for 3 months, even accepted a surrender, and then they launched a violent coup anyway, overthrew him, appointed these, combination of international bankers on one end and the fascists on the other, and have basically immediately started disenfranchising the population of Ukraine. I would say that Russia had no choice but to react in this case. This was a serious, serious threat to Russian national security, let alone the actual citizenry in Ukraine, and it just had to happen. I mean, I don't see any other choice that Moscow could have done and retained any shred of sovereignty.
Sir Michael, let's speak about the sovereignty of Ukraine. I mean, there's ample evidence that the United States and the European Union were violating the sovereignty of Ukraine. It breaks the country. We have this. We have the Crimeans saying that they will not be ruled by people that are ruling in Kiev. A lot of them are very unsavory characters, but nonetheless, they're in cahoots with the EU. I can understand international law, but the West supports people when they want them to have self-determination. Why can't Russia do the same thing?
I don't accept that whole analysis. I think what we saw in the Ukraine was an indigenous uprising against a president who had become deeply unpopular, so deeply unpopular that he fled his country. And you've got an interim president now until they can have some proper elections, which they're planning to do, and the sooner they can, the better. And meanwhile, from what we saw from outside, Russia stimulated the crisis in the Crimea by handing out extra passports and then running a referendum that was not seen by the outside world as legitimate, didn't allow observers in, and so forth.
There were observers from over a dozen countries there. I've spoken to them personally. They were there and they observed it. So saying that there were no OSCE is not the only organization in the world. Okay, and a lot of people would say it's very biased on top of that. Okay, I've heard these arguments as well. I mean, that's fine. Go ahead, please do.
Peter,
continue.
can I just finish that? I mean, I think the risk of where we're going. May I go ahead, Peter? I think the risk of where we're now going in the international community is that Russia is isolating itself. And here is a country that, after the fall of the Cold War, end of the Cold War, joined the G8, became the modern Russia, which we all enjoyed. And I worry that Russia is turning its back on that polity of nations, that international community. It's been universally criticized by all the leading countries.
Well,
if Russia
certainly
wants to move back
China,
to a world where
certainly
it has
not
a limited
India,
number of
certainly
friends,
not most of the other BRIC countries. That's really an exaggeration here. And Leboshin, you want to jump in here in Washington? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, with all due respect, Sir Michael keeps using the phrase international community. I'm not sure it means what he thinks it means. The proper international community ought to be the United Nations. But we've seen time and again, especially in the case of the former Yugoslavia, which I've been working on for years, that the international community in practice means the US and NATO. And they considered themselves to be the world opinion. And I'm sure that many people in the West enjoyed Russia in the 1990s, as I'm sure that 99.9% of the Russians did not. And that things have changed since the 1990s. Russia is no longer a country that everybody can plunder at will. And I think that sticks in the craw of many people in the West.
Jacques, if I can go to you, one of the
where did you see the...
okay, so Sir Michael, you want to respond? Then I'll go to Jacques in Paris. Please do, sir. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask where the United Nations Security Council resolution was that authorized Russia to do what it did in Crimea. On the contrary, the United Nations Security Council had passed a resolution with a Chinese abstention firmly condemning that.
The Boyshid? Did we have that with Kosovo?
The resolution was vetoed by Russia, as it was its right, and I would counter-ask, where was the resolution authorizing NATO to launch an attack in Kosovo 15 years ago? There wasn't one.
Sir Michael?
There was a UN special... Let's not go back there.
Okay. All right, Jacques, I mean, one of the things I think is very interesting is that a lot of people like to ignore in Western media is that the European Union turned its back on a deal on February 21st to simmer this crisis down in Ukraine, and it walked away from it as thugs took over the government. This is one of the reasons why Russia is not pleased at talking with the European Union now when it comes to Ukraine. They can't be trusted. Go ahead, Jacques.
Yeah, it's very clearly an operation from of a Western oligarchy. It's not such or such government. It's a Western oligarchy based on London and Wall Street who pushed for that provocation. And once you're right, once there was the agreement with Yanukovych, then immediately this was thrown away, and Europeans, instead of maintaining the agreement, said, all right, it's like that, well, let's go on with that. And then you have the illegal government of Yatsenyuk in power, and Europeans went along with that. So as for the Crimean case, you have the precedent of Kosovo, but also the Malvinas. When the British organized a referendum on the Malvinas in a territory that Christina Kirchner is saying now today in Paris belongs to Argentina, nobody blamed the British for organizing this referendum and saying the Malvinas are the Falkland and they are British.
Okay, Nebojsa, right before we go to the break, you know, it gets down to what countries like referendums and which ones they don't. It gets down to that, doesn't it?
It pretty much comes down to who makes the rules. And in the Western script, they are allowed everything and nobody else is allowed anything.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Staying with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent developments in Ukraine. Okay, I'd like to go back to Sir Michael in London. You know, Sir Michael, when I was growing up and my mother took me to the store and I picked something up and I broke it, the owner of the store would say, well, you broke it, you have to pay for it. So the European Union was so quick to recognize this government in Kiev. The country's broken, so you should pay for it.
I mean, I think it is certainly the case that the Ukrainian economy is in a desperate position. If you look at the equivalence between Poland and Ukraine at the time of the end of the Cold War, they were roughly the same. In the intervening period, Poland has developed an economy that is 2 or 3 times stronger than Ukraine. So a lot of help is now needed for the Ukraine. I quite accept that. And I think both the IMF and the European Union and others will do what they can to help get the economy back on its feet. It's very important. And ideally, we do that in cooperation with Russia. It seems to me there's a joint interest in us all that Ukraine should not founder, should not fall apart economically.
Well, I mean, if I want to remind our viewers that Russia did step in and try to do that before the coup in Kiev, unfortunately. Jacques, if I can go to you, I mean, who should pay for all of this? I mean, the IMF always has a plan, but it's not usually very people-friendly, if you know what I mean.
Well, Yatsenyuk said it. We had to reduce the pensions by 50%. So it's an austerity policy. This policy was described very clearly on May 28, 2013 by JP Morgan. They said that the democratic regimes are an impediment, they are a problem for the measures to be taken of austerity or rigor or whatever against the populations. So in Ukraine, what they are trying to do is making the Ukrainian people pay for the horrors and the terrible mistakes of the oligarchs. And if you go more in depth into this question, generally, you have a system, a world system today, which is a world system of the city of London and Wall Street and their allies, which is a system which is described by certain people in France, like Jean-François Guéraud, as a systematic, like, criminal system. So the case of Ukraine is a case in point in that it's a point in this system, but it's not the cause of the system. It doesn't come from inside Ukraine. It comes from a world system that doesn't work. And you have all these complicity between the oligarchs in the West, the oligarchs in Russia, the oligarchs in Ukraine. And the only way to get out of that is to have a new world development system with an agreement between the West and Russia for a community of development, a real development, not what you have today.
But unfortunately, that's very rhetorical. Jacques, that's very rhetorical at this point here.
Wall Street.
Nebojsa, if I can go to you in Washington. Sir Michael said that Russia should help pay for this.
At all.
Well, in this context, it is. Let me go to Washington right now. Nebojsa, Sir Michael said that Russia should help. I mean, it did try to step in. It did give a tranche of $3 billion in Eurobonds. I mean, why should Russia step in now? It didn't break Ukraine. This coup did. It broke the country. It's actually broken its sovereignty now. Go ahead.
Well, I don't understand the reasoning here. So Russians are evil people who have invaded and occupied Ukraine, but they should give it economic aid to the government that is rabidly anti-Russian and illegitimate and illegal and is trying to suppress Russian rights in Ukraine? I honestly don't understand this. I mean, Ukraine was on a development tick earlier in the last decade, and then came the Orange Revolution and 6 years of that. So that's what ruined the country. And I mean, Poland, yes, we can compare it to Poland, but if Poland is so prosperous, why are so many Poles working as day laborers in Britain? Honestly. And how is helping Ukraine financially being done by taking Ukrainian gold and seizing it and taking it to the United States for alleged safekeeping? I mean, these are not helpful actions at all. So Michael, I honestly don't think that the current regime in Kiev would accept Russian aid even if Russia offered it.
Okay, well, I think they would probably take anything. That's the kind of caliber of people they are. Sir Michael, I mean, would you react to what Nebojsa said there? I mean, here's a government that's so rabidly anti-Russian that the Crimeans wanted to escape it. And why would Russia get involved in a catastrophe that it didn't make?
I'm not talking about tomorrow. I'm talking about the day after tomorrow and the year after tomorrow, and how we in Europe, and Russia is one part of Europe, how we create an economic space and a legal and political space where we can all work and live together. Now, if Russia, through its actions and through the reactions that they force on us, wishes to go back to a sort of economic Cold War, I fear that Russia will be the long-term loser from that. Can I just remind you that Russia exports 170 billion euros to Europe and 60 billion to China. Which way does Russia want to turn? Now, if it's with Europe, we need to work together to get this crisis behind us and rebuild the economies that we're talking about.
Okay, but Sir Michael, again, I'd like to remind our viewers here, before this crisis really blew up, the Russian side said, hey, why don't we have a trilateral commission here? The three players, European Union, Ukraine, and Russia, and the European Union dismissed it out of hand. Was that a mistake?
Why did Russia not come to the meeting of the Budapest Agreement a couple of weeks ago, of which it was a signature? Russia doesn't want to deal with the Europeans on this. And that seems to me to be a retrograde step, a step backwards.
Can you answer my question, though? Can you answer my question? We're talking about three parties trying to get out of a crisis that has only gotten far, far worse. We can talk about the Budapest Treaty a little bit later, but this was a country that's on its knees, it's facing default in a matter of weeks, and the European Union said, no, we don't do it that way, but they do it with other countries. Was it a mistake? I'm going to repeat my question.
And it was not a mistake. It was because of the conditionality that Russia was attaching to its support for the Ukraine at that period, which was unacceptable to the other parties. These things have to be cooperative.
But that's why Yanukovych walked away from the association agreement, because it's a conditionality was so stressful for the Ukrainian population that he walked away from it. Agreed?
How popular do you think Yanukovych is in Ukraine today?
That's neither here nor there anymore. I'm talking about political realities that all of us have to face. And Sir Michael, I will agree with you. Nobody needs a country like Ukraine on its back right now between Russia and the European Union. But because of the rhetoric that is coming out of Western capitals, of punishment and of costs and of sanctions, I think everyone, the Europeans and the Westerners, are shooting themselves in the foot here. Because the political fact is on the ground. It is reality right now. We have to move on. Would you agree or disagree with me in Washington, Nebojsa?
I would say so. I mean, it's a little cynical of the Europeans and the Americans to start complaining about the situation now when they've midwifed it. They've quite literally midwifed the current situation, in the words of Victoria Nuland. I mean, what's their end game here? Do they even care about the people of Ukraine at all? Or was the whole scandal aimed at just discrediting and hurting Russia? I think the latter. I think the whole episode with the coup, both now and back in 2004, was aimed at Moscow. And there are people out in the West here who are out of the establishment now officially, but unofficially still members of it, who've openly admitted to it.
So, Michael, would you agree with that? I mean, Victoria Nuland's it's a smoking gun. It's a pretty obvious smoking gun.
I mean, Victoria Nuland has made lots of comments, some of which have been leaked in strange ways. I mean, I'm not her spokesman, but I don't agree at all with the Washington view we just heard. It seems to me that actually the crisis we've got to, as I said right at the start, has come about because of the way Russia has annexed or tried to annex the Crimea. And we need now to look forward, not backwards, about why we got here, but we clearly need to find a way to get de-escalation of that and to get back into cooperation about the future of the region. And if not, we will have to go down the path of tougher measures on our side. And now, there's a meeting of the summit as we speak this evening. I think you'll see from that another series of measures that will hurt Russia.
You were shaking your head in Washington.
Well, cooperation seems to mean do what we tell you. And this is not, again, we're using the definitions that are in no English dictionary here, sir. Cooperation should mean give and take. It shouldn't mean one side dictating everything to the other. And it seems to be the view of both Washington and London, and unfortunately Paris and Berlin, that cooperation is Russia doing what it's told. Well, excuse me, sir, but we've heard this 2 days ago. Russia will no longer do what it's told because that's not the world anymore.
Okay, Jacques, how has the
when
world...
Russia sends troops into a sovereign neighbour, I regard as a provocation. I don't regard that as being told
again,
what
I would like to correct it. I would like to make sure our viewers know that in I hate wasting valuable television time on this. A treaty was signed in 1999 between Russia and Ukraine. Up to 25,000 troops were allowed to be in the Crimean Peninsula. It was updated in 2010, and the treaty is to 2042, okay? And the Russians pay millions of dollars every single year. So there was no invasion at all. Troops were already there on the ground, okay? And I don't know why that's such a missing piece of information.
Requires that they stay in their barracks.
There is no constitutional order in Ukraine because of what the European Union and the United States has done to the poor country called Ukraine. Sir Michael, I'll give you the last word, sir. Go ahead. Go ahead, sir.
No, I was just saying on that all I was saying on that troop stationment, that it needed agreement from the Kiev government for them to come outside their barracks beyond a certain number. And they came out in much greater numbers than that, as we saw, as they took over the Ukraine.
Okay.
But we should be talking about the future, not the past.
Would you agree that that's a legal government? This is why we got into this murky situation in the first place. Washington, last word.
That the government in Kiev is illegal? Absolutely. It came through power in a de facto military coup, backed from the outside actors. It cannot possibly be a legitimate government under any definition.
Okay, gentlemen, we're not going to resolve anything on this program, but it was a fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests in London, Paris, and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.